Father, that you would just fill Ben with your presence and your peace, that you would guide his words as he shares with us. And Lord, we open our hearts up to hear what it is that you want to say to us through Ben this evening. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Oh, strange. It's always really weird when it's just all this stuff is happening and suddenly it's just like, oh, and now I'm talking. Like it's like, that's the only thing going on right now. It's very surreal. I'm still getting used to it, to be honest. I'm continuing on with our Joseph series. We have done 2 weeks on Joseph so far. We had Pete Sherlock share first. Highly recommend going through the last 2 weeks, by the way. Pete kind of shared on the beginning of Joseph's story. Bon shared last week. Both Pete was sharing on kind of holding on to God's promises. Bon was sharing about what we do when life around us is really difficult and kind of choosing faithfulness. I'm going to kind of continue on with that thematic today. I get the kind of really good part of this story, of the story of Joseph, because so far Bon and Pete have just talked about all the, like, Joseph's life getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And I get, like, the part where he's kind of restored and going okay. So I'm excited. I've got the kind of turnaround point today. Pretty much, so I'm going to be speaking next week as well. And tonight and next week, we're going to be going through Genesis 41, breaking it into 2 little chunks. And kind of talking on the idea of God's will and suffering and what our response amidst all of that is supposed to be, God's intention and purpose for our life. I guess one little thing really quick. You'll notice I've got an extra little microphone here. It's a little mini mic. We've been catching up with the young adults. Last week we had our vision night on Sunday after church. And this week we had another probably, maybe it's 15 of us caught up together and talked through 3 different areas, evangelism, events, and social media. Just 3 things that we wanted to spend a little bit more time focusing on and kind of stirring up. This is social media. So that'll be something. I don't really know what it'll look like, but Usher's on the case with it. That's just if you were confused by that. If you are not familiar with this story, let me give you a quick recap. The story of Joseph happened about 4,000 years ago in ancient Egypt. It's a kind of time and culture we know a lot about, but also don't really know that much about. So, like, for instance, Joseph spent time in the prison, and I was doing some research. What do we actually know about Egyptian prisons? Not all that much, because the Egyptians kind of invented prisons. Like, they were like some of the earliest records of prisons that we have, and there's really not that much out there about them. So it's just like a really weird time in history. If you don't know Joseph's story, so Genesis 41, where we're going to land today, is kind of him kind of being lifted up out of prison, responding to the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer, and essentially telling Pharaoh the meaning of his dream, sharing an interpretation. That's about as much ground as we'll cover today. To get to that point, Joseph was one of 13 children, one of 12 boys. He had a dream about some wheat, and then was thrown in the pit, and then was sold as a slave, and then it's like this, the wife of the person he was the slave of tried to, like, riz him, and he said no, and then he became a prisoner in a dungeon in Egypt, and then he became the best prisoner, and that's about where we're left off at. So if you're caught up from that, good, beautiful. It's a really simple story. I've got a couple of verses. Simon, did you get those verses on the screen for me? I gave them to him late, so if you haven't, oh, that's great. You can read that. Get it up in your Bibles for me. We're going to just read through Genesis 41, just the first little chunk of it, just the first 39 verses, and we'll go from there, and I'll kind of springboard. Today, I want to go through this, but I'm going to use this story as a bit of a springboard to talk about some concepts, as opposed to breaking it down chunk by chunk, if that's all right, just to give you a bit of a heads up. So let's jump into it. Grab your Bibles open, Genesis 41. I'm doing the same, and I'm going to read through it, and we'll start with that. Genesis 41. All right, okay. Then it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river. Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine-looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking cows and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke, and he slept and dreamed a second time. And suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. Are we on track? Everyone's following all right? We're good? Okay, they're blighted. They've sprung up and eaten the other ones. So the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. So now came the morning that his spirit was kind of troubled. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all of the wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day when Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody of the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. We each had a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now, there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard. And we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. Then it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him, as in the baker got hanged. The Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. He shaved and changed his clothing and came to Pharaoh. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, I have a dream, and there's no one who can interpret it. But I've heard that you can understand a dream, so to interpret it. So Joseph, the verbiage of these passages is so weird. It's like no one talks like this. So Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream, I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt. And he explains the whole dream. We're going to jump right to the end of him explaining the whole dream. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, in verse 25, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 empty heads blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be alone in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. And the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. Now therefore let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint the officers of the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. Are we all keeping up? Verse 35, real good? Yep, great. That's a great response. And let them gather all the food those good years that are coming, and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for the 7 years of famine which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. So the advice of Pharaoh was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servant, can we find such a one as this, a man who is the Spirit of God? Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, insomuch as God has shown you all this, there is no one as discerning and as wise as you. All right, that's it. That's all we're covering tonight. This is like essentially a total turnaround point for Joseph. He's gone through kind of blight after blight. But before we dive into it too much, because as I said, I'm going to springboard off this. Before we dive in, I want you to hold something in your head. I want you to think of something in your life, and this can either be a present thing, a present reality for you, or something maybe in your past, maybe something you've gone through. Something that you've either sought God for or that you are seeking God for right now. And particularly, I want you to think, like, is there a family conflict? Is there, like, persecution that you're experiencing? Is your work environment difficult? Are you thinking family hardship? Maybe you've been seeking him for finances or for healing for something. I want to address the way that we react to these kinds of things and God's intention for our lives in the context of some of this stuff. And for a lot of people, this stuff is, I'm talking about deep and personal stuff. I'm talking about intense things. So I want you to hold it in your head, and we're going to touch on it as we go through. Because, life is very real, and we can very easily just skim over the nice story of Joseph and never really let it touch the deepest, most challenging parts of our lives, our kind of deepest struggles. So I want you to think of something. When you've got something in your head, just give you a little bit of a moment. I'm going to zoom out and kind of look at the way that Joseph acts during his life and in his story, how that prepares us, and what model that gives us for how we should live. Fair? Yeah? Okay, beautiful. Actually, I want to talk a little bit about God's will. We're going to kind of dance around the idea of non-deterministic providence tonight, which is a kind of broad framework for how we view God's interaction with the world. We'll get to that in a little bit, but I want to suggest something tonight, that there were multiple solutions, there were multiple pathways to Joseph fulfilling his calling. So we think that through. Often we can think that Joseph's or anyone's kind of meteoric rise was only possible because of the trauma and difficult things that he went through. Yeah? I want to think that through, because I think that that's a really common perspective, and it's fair that it is. My angle on this, my message to you tonight, is God is more creative than that. If God wants to achieve something, there are many ways that he can get there. And he does not need to put you through horrible, difficult, dreadful circumstances in order to position you in the place that you're supposed to be. Yeah? Okay. So Joseph's position in Pharaoh's court fulfilled his promise, the promise over his life. And remember, Joseph's not just carrying one promise. He's not just carrying the dreams that he dreamt as a youngster. Joseph is also carrying the promise of his fathers. Joseph is unknowingly walking into a time where the entire region's about to descend into famine and death, and many people die during this period in the area. Joseph, unknowingly, in some senses, is actually carrying the promise that was spoken over Abraham. It's the promise of a nation coming from Abraham. Yeah? So he's not just carrying the promises over his own life, the image of the wheat and of the stars that Pete took us through, I think it was Pete, in the first one. He's actually carrying the promises of his fathers. So I want you to keep that in mind. Here's the challenge for us, and why I think we find this so difficult sometimes. God is so good at handling negative situations that often we confuse him as the author of negative situations. Yeah? God is so good at handling negative situations that often we confuse him as the author. Yeah? And I want to be really, really clear with this, because we can get stumped on this, and I think many, many Christians fall into this trap. It is not God's will for you to suffer. God's intention of your life is not for you to be traumatized. Yeah? So whatever your suffering looks like, whatever the thing you are seeking God for, or that you have sought God for in the past, whether that's sickness, financial hardship, mental health struggles, family breakdown, addiction, any kind of trauma, it is not God's will for you to suffer. And I want to clarify with this, of course God can test your faith, and he can use these things to test our faith. He can certainly refine our character amidst these things. He can certainly discipline us, but that's a very different thing. But the testing and the refining is never God's predetermined reason for your suffering. Yeah. All right. Beautiful thing, though, is when we go through these difficult patches in our life, really, really difficult things, it often presents a really clear opportunity, a really clear window for us to see where our hearts are actually at. Often, really difficult things just kind of hold up a mirror to our face and show what's there kind of under the surface. And the challenge to us tonight is that only the parts of our life that get disturbed by difficulty are the ones that aren't supposed to be there. Only the parts of your life that are disturbed by difficulty are the ones that aren't supposed to be there. You get where I'm going with this? We, a while back, and I've told this story so many times, but I love this story, and I really think it's very relevant. I lived as a really crappy Christian for a really long time. Crappy in the sense that I said I was Christian, I had the shell over the top, but my life was hard. My life was grueling. And we were going through difficult stuff as well. I had my own mental health stuff going on. I was dead poor and had 2 kids, and Ellie had her own stuff that she was going through. We were not in a good place at all. And it spiraled and got worse and worse for us. And it came to a turning point where really I can say Ellie and I, both together, we sought God in a way that we never had before. We threw ourselves fully at him. and lay our lives down. Really, not in the sense that we did anything really different, but our perspective shifted. This was shortly before we fell pregnant with Erin, if you know Erin, my youngest little one. When we went into one of the first scans for Erin's pregnancy, I think it was how many weeks was it, Elle? 7 weeks? 7? Wow. 7 weeks in, you did the first scan, and what actually came up was a lump on one of Ellie's ovaries. And the reason I tell this story is because our reaction was so strange. Our reaction was so unfamiliar to me, because I just lived the previous 26 years of my life being rolled again and again and again by every time life went wrong. Yeah. But instead, this time, when we saw this thing appear, and when we sat in the office of the oncologist, and when we got told we probably or could lose the baby, and we have to have surgery, major surgery in the second trimester or first trimester of pregnancy, and all this stuff, usually would be racing through our minds. But instead, I vividly remember beaming and almost like skipping in my step as we walked out across the lawn in front of the sand. Because for the first time in my whole life, I'd experienced a peace that actually meant I was living unaffected by my surroundings. And you can tell everyone that you have peace. You can tell everyone that you're walking in supernatural peace. But it's only when a difficult thing comes along that you actually have a chance to reveal it. So when I say the parts of your life that are disturbed by hardship are the parts that aren't supposed to be there, the way that we react to hardship should be totally different to that of the world. And instead of being crumbled by difficult things, we remain unaffected. I want to keep moving down that line. Hopefully you know what I mean by springboard of Joseph. The way I want to click this into Joseph's testimony is the person that he was as a slave, the person that he was as a prisoner, was the same person that he was in the court of the Pharaoh. Joseph lived unchanged by his surroundings. And that's the calling of our lives, is to walk as if nothing around us, not as if, walk because nothing around us has got anything to do with whether or not we carry and reflect the nature of Jesus. Yeah? Okay. Non-deterministic providence. I want to explain this because God's will, particularly when we talk about healing and hardship, is a little bit complex. Deterministic, actually providence probably is a better one to start with, is just kind of God's involvement with creation. It's the way that he interacts with things. Deterministic is to say that he micromanages every little thing that happens and nothing happens that he hasn't decided would happen. And non-deterministic was he kind of allows creation to unfold, still plays an active role in it, but allows things to unfold. This is the kind of view that was developed in more recent years by people like C.S. Lewis or Dallas Willard or N.T. Wright, if you're familiar with any of those authors. It's the view that kind of stands over the vineyard as a whole. We've got our own finesse on how we apply that. But it's really important because you can look at Joseph's story in one of two ways. You can look at Joseph's story as an orchestration, a strange orchestration of God, to put him into a position of power, first taking him right down to the depths. In all honesty, that's a really strange trajectory. But looking at it through the lens of non-deterministic providence, we say he was sold because of his brother's sin, sold into slavery because of his brother's sin. He was tempted by Potiphar's wife because of her sin. And he was imprisoned because of the injustice. Now, was God present through all of that? Absolutely. Did God work through all of that? Absolutely. But we cannot confuse God being good at dealing with hardship as him being the author of it. Yeah? All right, okay, beautiful. So instead of kind of cursing God's plan in the pit, Joseph allowed his calling to operate in the position that he was in whatever place he was in. And his will, God's will, flowed through Joseph instead of God's will happening to him. That's the call. That's the call for us, is instead of allowing or believing that God's will is something we stumble into blindly, we take on board that God's will has been revealed to us through Jesus, revealed to us through the Spirit now as we walk around with us. And God's will is less something that we encounter in the world and more something that happens through us. So God's will happening through us, not to us. Yeah? I just want you to take back to that concept, that event, that thing you're seeking God for. just to bring that to the surface of your mind, what would it mean? What would it mean? Like practically, what would that look like if God's will was flowing through you, as opposed to viewing that situation itself, that difficulty, as God's will? What difference would that make to your positioning? All right. Can we chuck Romans 8 on the verse? Romans 8 on the board. Romans 8 verse. Yeah, good. Thank you so much, Simon. I appreciate you cobbling that together for me. We'll get there. That's fine. Romans 8. Yes. Okay. Amazing. You guys familiar with this verse? I reckon this is perhaps one of the most misapplied verses in the whole Bible. And I want to go through it. Okay. So, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, so that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. Now that first chunk of the verse, we, as a church, Big C, are guilty of applying that again and again and again to say that God was the author of difficult situations in our lives in order to bring about good. Yeah? God intends difficult things to happen to us throughout our lives with sometimes an obvious intention of strengthening us or bringing people together or achieving some good. But sometimes we don't even know. Sometimes it's a mysterious good. Sometimes it seems to be, through that lens, that God is actually working towards some unknown good that will be revealed to us at the end of time. Have we come across this line of thinking before? Yeah, if I'm challenging you and you're going, oh, I don't know about this, good. That's exactly what I want to be doing tonight, because I want to break this down. Okay, so this verse, flippin' amazing. I'm just going to chunk through it because reading through it with this different perspective is mind-bogglingly amazing. Okay, so, and we know, so we are sure, we're absolutely sure, we know that in all things, in every single thing in your life, God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purposes. So God actively intervenes in the lives of what? Two things. People who love him and people who have been called according to his purpose. So people who are living out his will in the world. Yeah? For those God foreknew, he also predestined. So anyone who decides, oh, I need it right now. It's okay, I got it on the page. Oh, no, I don't. Do I? I do, I've got it on the page. Okay, so for those God foreknew, he also predestines. For anyone that turns to God has been like designed, the way that you've been designed was to be conformed. Where are we? To conform to the image of his Son. So the idea is that you will look more and more like Jesus, so that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. Do you get where I'm going with this? So we read like this, like it's got this hidden bad purpose behind this. But the reality of this is saying that if you love him and if you've given your life to his purpose, then regardless of your context, regardless of the difficulty that you're facing, God will actually practically intervene in your life in order to bring all things into conformity with you living victorious in the mission that you are called to. Because, and what's the because? It's kind of before. What's the reason behind this? Because we're supposed to look like Jesus. We're supposed to look like Jesus. We're called to live victorious, and Jesus was not supposed to be the only one living like this. He was just supposed to be the first of many. Do you get where I'm going? So regardless of the situation, the difficult situation you encounter in your life, if you've given your life to him, if you're walking out the purpose that you've been called to, the path folds around you to ensure that you can do the things that God has asked you to do. Because that's what you were designed for. Yeah? That's a whole lot different to difficult things rising to meet you in the road and freaking out because I don't know why God's put this here. Yeah? Okay. All right. I honestly think that Christian after Christian has just been steamrolled right out of this mission because we mistake survival for purpose. And often we never really fight the difficult things in our lives because we've already conceded the battle. We're already under the belief that the thing happening to us is the thing that God has intended. So we don't fight. We give up. And I want to challenge you on that today because we can so easily just switch into spiritual survival mode. And when we're not fighting the thing in front, the thing that we're called to fight, the reality is we end up just fighting to be okay. And you can live week after week begging God for a spiritual experience to come in and surround you so that you can last, so that you can just make it to the next one. When Christians, we're called to rise up. We're called to rise up and actually engage in the battle that we've been born into. Okay, the pit is not the point. The pit is not the point. So we can get so concerned sometimes with the situation in front of us that we actually forget the calling and the destiny over our lives. Joseph lived with God's prophecy over his life, knowing that he was destined for leadership, destined to succeed, destined to walk in God's authority. Yet we can see by the life that he chose to live that his perspective was just not colored by his context at all. Okay, all through Scripture, Jesus kind of makes this look super easy, like this is just a super easy thing that we do. In fact, he says over at least 10 times in Jesus' ministry alone, where he says, ask and it will be given to you. Do you know these verses? The really challenging verses that say, ask for anything and I'll give it to you. And we can add a whole lot of conditions to that sometimes. But the reality is, Jesus preaches it about 10 times himself, recorded times in the Gospels, and then goes on, it's mentioned maybe about 30 times in the whole New Testament. This thing comes up and up again and again and again. The reality behind this is because is that as your mind kind of aligns with God's will, your desires shift. And when you walk fully surrendered to this, when you walk fully surrendered to the will of God as it's revealed to you, things change. I have a good metaphor for this. I think it's a good metaphor. If you think it's good, that sounded a little bit cocky. If you had like a shovel, yeah, a big old shovel, and you got a tea bag and some boiling water, and made a cup of tea in the divot of the shovel, and then poured in the milk, and then drank the tea from the shovel, you'd have a really hard time doing that, right? That sounds like a feat. Like that sounds really difficult. Just as much, if you had a teacup and you went out into the garden and tried to dig a hole, you'd also struggle. I really want to think that if we miss our purpose, if we miss the intention that we were designed for, life actually becomes really difficult. Life becomes grueling when we're not living in the way that we're called to. Okay, all right. I want to break out of this actually, because so often we can get caught up on just dealing with the problem at hand, the difficulty at hand, that we forget the thing that we were created for. And we end up misusing our identity, misusing our calling, misusing our lives, and centering ourselves around something that's just not the point. I'll give you an example of this. When we were really poor, Ellie and I was working in an USH at the time, and we were pregnant with our second child, and I was a single income earner paying rent in Sydney, and we were not making very much. So I decided I need to get a job. And so I typed onto the internet, what is the most money I can make with no experience or qualifications? And up on the first two things on the page came recruitment and real estate agents. And I thought, I don't want to be a real estate agent because they all walk around in like suits on a Saturday. I just want a 9 to 5. The reality was I didn't get a 9 to 5, I got an 8 till 8. And my job in the city in recruitment was like grueling. It was a tough job. The interview for that job has always hung over me as like one of my biggest regrets. Honestly, one of the things I really regret the most. Because I made it all the way through that interview, and we were right on the end. Like I was about to finish my contract with USH, within a week. And as I was interviewing for this place, back then, because your contract, I was a part-timer, contractor staff at the USH. Every time I took time off to go into the city to get an interview, we took a hit. And we were already in debt, probably at that point. So we were really struggling. And so interviewing place after place after place, got a bit irked by some of the cultures, decided not to go with them. Had this interview finally with this one place that looked really good. And the interview went really, really well. It just graced straight through the interview. But right at the end of the interview, because I put on my CV youth leader, because I thought, maybe it'll help. It didn't help. Right at the end of the interview, they said, look, we know you're a Christian, because they'd been open about my faith in the interview as well. We know you're a Christian, But I just want to let you know that we do some things around here that might not be might not really agree with you. Is that okay? Is that okay? And what they're really talking about, they were talking about lying to candidates, lying to clients, even just the culture of drugs in the office. They're just talking about tricky business operations that were unscrupulous. And I was aware of that. I was fully aware. And my response in that moment was not, no way, I'm leaving, and trusting in faith, God will give me a job. I needed money. I really needed money. And I needed to provide for my family. And so I said, yeah, that's all right. That's okay with me. And I went forwards. And the next 8 months were some of the most grueling months of my life. I was clenching my fists through the whole day. We had no money. We had less money there than we did when I was working at the UISH. and the days were longer, and it was harder work. And I was just exhausted by the end of it. Actually ended up having pneumonia about 8 months in, and was in hospital for a little while, and then came back out and got fired. And what I want to say is, when you let go of the purpose, when you let go of the thing that you were intended for and give it up to chase something else, life is hard. Life is grueling. And what I want to suggest is, while life still doesn't become any less difficult, while we might not face as many, we might face just the same number of difficulties when we're walking out our lives now as Christians, our response to them is different. And the calling over us is to walk totally different. Our reactions are called to be totally different from the reactions that we would have had if we were walking outside of faith. Do you get what I'm saying? Yeah? The challenge to us is sometimes fragility is kind of like safe. Sometimes we like being kind of needy a little bit. Do you know what I mean? Sometimes we like people coming around and caring for us. And that's a good thing. That's a beautiful thing. But don't fall into the trap of remaining there, because you were not called to fragility in faith, you were called to strength. I want to read through a verse, another one that's often thrown around as with different interpretations often. And it's got an insertion that we put in. It's in 2 translations out of about 100 translations out there. Does anyone have the NLT with them? NLT translation. This is the translation that I grew up with. Awesome. If you read 2 Corinthians, can you have a look? Verse 7, just before it says treasure in, what's the words that it uses? Do you have it? I'll give you a moment to have a look. I'll read this one. It says, "But we have this treasure in jars of clay to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us. We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed. We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body." What's NLT say? Just the first verse. Oh, yes, Simon. Okay, can you guys see that on the board there? Okay, can I read it out? Or do you want to read it out for us, just verse 7? I've got the mic, thank you, that makes so much more sense. Okay, what are we on? What's the verse again? 2, 4, 7. Okay, verse 7. Okay, now we have this light. This is NLT. We have this light shining in our hearts, but we ourselves are like fragile clay jars containing this great treasure. Hear that little word? We like to throw that word around a lot, but that word's actually not in there. If you read through the Greek, that word is an insertion, and it's an assumption based on the idea of how clay jars were used. We have clay jars in first century Judaism, first century kind of Middle Eastern. They were used as kind of storage. They were the equivalent of Tupperware. So you think that they would hold flour and food and sometimes grapes, like that kind of stuff. That's what they were used for. Now, we think fragile because clay is a little bit fragile, and you could have vessels from different things. You could make vessels from metal. You could make vessels from whatever. But the key attribute of a clay jar is that it is just not anything special. It's not anything special. It's very, very regular. It's the same as the old Tupperware box that you've got all the little white marks and maybe the orange stains around the side. Those ones? That's essentially what this is saying. It's saying in this crappy old Tupperware container, you're carrying around like the crown jewels. Yeah? That would be weird. Yeah? We like to chuck the word fragile in there sometimes. It just does not appear. It appears in two translations. As I said, it appears in the NLT, and it appears also in a really old-style language translation from about 100 years ago. It doesn't appear anywhere else. But sometimes we can read in fragile. I was also always confused when people do this, because I've heard it so many times. When we say, fragile, we're so fragile that carry this treasure, so that the world knows that this treasure is not from us, because we're fragile beings, fragile, helpless beings. And this all-surpassing power in us is clearly not from us because of how fragile we are. But if we go on to read the next verses, you'll find that it's describing anything but fragile. That's not fragile. It's describing something that's hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed. So under extreme pressure, but not crushed. Perplexed, totally have no idea what the heck's going on, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not abandoned. Struck down, but not destroyed. Always carrying around us the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body. The verse is not saying we're weak, it's saying we carry God's all-surpassing power in very humanly vessels. And it is in despite of our very unpowerful human form that we were able to walk in his power, particularly as we face hardship. We often read our own experience of fragility into this verse, and we can get stuck in the belief system that it's not actually possible for us to overcome some things. We get stuck in the mantra of the world, like que sera, sera, like life is hard, and that's just the reality. What Paul is saying, and what Joseph's life reveals to us, is even when we're in the pit, the palace, or the prison, the difficult situations or the fantastic situations, your calling is never lost. Your ability to respond to your situation is never lost. Your ability to walk out the person that you are supposed to be is never lost. Yeah? So what do we do now? How much time have I got left? Oh, yeah. Okay. What do we do now? A few bits. Don't concede the battle. What's the thing that you've got in your head? Maybe it's something you've been seeking God for. Maybe it's something you've been seeking God for a really long time. Don't concede, firstly. And if you need help to not concede, that's what we're for as a church. We're called to rise up and fight against the evil forces of this world, not be steamrolled by them. The devil is trapped in the earth with us, not the other way around. Yeah? Now, we actually don't have the ability to do this in and of ourselves. And that's what we've got to recognize, is that we, on the outside, are pretty normal. Like, we're pretty regular looking things, meaty and bony, and kind of just regular. But in us is stashed what Paul calls the all-surpassing power of God. The all-surpassing power of God. So that regardless of your situation, regardless of the hopelessness or the relentlessness of the life that you are living right now, you've got the ability, the power to overcome and walk in the victory that you were designed to walk in. Okay, 3 things. If you feel like what I'm asking you to do is impossible, good. That's the right territory to be in. If it's possible, then it's not big enough. If I'm asking you to fight something in your life that seems too hard to fight, that's the right things that we need to be pursuing God for. And if you feel like it's going to be a lot of work, I want you to think maybe God has another way to solve it that you can't see. He's got 100 solutions to any problem. Are you limiting God's power in your life because of the innate lack of creativity that we hold? There's 100 different ways to skin a cat. Your role is not to understand how he's going to do things. Your role is to know what he wills to happen and to believe his words of your life. Okay, and grace, finally, thank heavens, means that you're empowered to do things that are not possible despite your best efforts. You're empowered to live in a way that's actually impossible for you to live if you are trying your absolute hardest. If you picked the best human in the whole earth and set them against doing one thing in faith, they would not be able to achieve it. Yeah? Because what we're talking about is supernatural empowerment flowing through us, not human empowerment. And the peaks of human existence are below the lives that God has called us out to live. And again, if that feels beyond us, good. That's what we need to be looking for. Finally, I want to leave you with this last bit, because this kind of feeds into next week and what I want to talk about, is that your lives and your testimony of going through this hardship Just as Joseph's testimony was from 4,000 years ago, your testimonies are powerful. And if you cycle forwards just 1,200 years in the Bible to the time of the exile, you'll find actually a really similar situation. This time, instead of 30-year-old Joseph, it's 20-year-old Daniel. And he's living in Nebuchadnezzar-run territory, King Nebuchadnezzar. And one night, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. But this time it's different. This time, Nebuchadnezzar says, instead of asking all the wise men to come and telling the dream and asking them to interpret, this time Nebuchadnezzar says, I'm sick of all these fake wise men, these fake magicians. If you're real, you'll come and tell me what my dream was and the interpretation. And if you can't do that, we'll just kill you. Pretty crazy. Daniel, no doubt, was well versed in the stories from the Torah. What do you think, and what effect do you think it would have had on Daniel hearing about an almost identical situation with a king having a dream, seeking an interpretation, and no one can interpret it? What effect do you think it would have had having that story in the back of his head? That's 1,200 years, that gap between those two, roughly. 1,200 years later, you've got no idea the weight of your story enduring and persevering and overcoming difficulty in your life will have, not just on the people around you, but on generations and generations to come. And we can choose to be steamrolled by life, or we can choose to rise up and fight the battle that we were designed to fight. Yeah? You with me? All right. Okay. Last things. Let's stand. I want to pray over this. Is that all right? Can I get a guitarist or a pianist? I don't know, just someone. Someone. It could be music in the background, I don't care. On your till, thank you. I want to pray some stuff over for us because fundamentally, if our situation around us is not God's control in order to build and change our character, then if that's what we believe, then we've fundamentally missed what he means when he talks about discipline. The reality is, you read Isaiah 54, God makes a covenant of peace with his people, never to be